Let's do some TOEFL listening. Today I'm going to show you some strategies that you can use to eliminate definitely wrong options without even listening to the lecture. Many of these strategies are the same as the one I teach in my TOEFL reading course. You can check out my TOEFL reading course by following the link below. For most of the questions, we are going to look at the question first, eliminate definitely wrong options based on my strategies, and then selectively listen to the lecture to identify the correct ones. Okay, let's get the party started. Number 1, this is the main idea question. So you need to listen to the lecture. I'm going to sample several parts of the lecture so that you can get the main idea.
There are 4 types of air masses, and the one we'll concentrate on today is the continental polar air mass. Continental polar air masses form over a continent near the poles, over areas that are typically cold and dry. And it's the polar air masses from the Arctic and northern Canada that largely influence weather patterns in the United States, especially in the east of the Rocky Mountains. Now, these continental polar air masses are not generally associated with heavy precipitation. In fact, since they generally remain dry and cold throughout their trek across North America, they bring the mostly clear skies and cooler temperatures we see throughout most of the eastern United States during the winter months. However, when a polar air mass sweeps across the Great Lakes region in late autumn and winter, it can bring extremely heavy snowfalls to that region. We refer to these snowstorms as lake effect snows, snows whose moisture comes from the Great Lakes themselves. Over one recent 10-year period, Rochester and Buffalo each received 27 meters of snow. It's nearly 90 feet. Okay, let's turn to the other pair of cities on this map, Thunder Bay and Marquette. Land doesn't store heat as effectively as water does. As a result, during the cold seasons, fall and winter, the land loses its heat quickly. The land gets cold fast. And as you go farther north, it gets very, very cold. But the lakes store heat more efficiently, so they stay warmer longer. So, because of their location, Marquette, Buffalo, and Rochester get buried each winter, while Thunder Bay, on Lake Superior's northern shore, doesn't get hit as hard.
So the lecture begins with the continental polar air mass and then moves on to talk about how the polar air affects snowfalls in the areas surrounding the Great Lakes. Now, this is the strategy for the main idea question. First, the correct choice will express the topic in a general term. Expect to see words like weather or regions. 2, the correct choice should be neither too broad nor too narrow. I will explain what I mean by these as I go through each option. Keeping these in mind, let's consider each option. A. Weather phenomenon is a general term. The passage talks about the lake effect snow event in the regions near the Great Lakes. The snow event is caused by the interaction between the continental polar air mass and the Great Lakes. There is nothing that jumps out at me to say A is suspicious, so I'm gonna keep A. B. While the passage talks about some data of snowfalls in different regions surrounding the Great Lakes, the main idea is not to report the data. The point is to explain why there is a difference in the snowfalls among the regions. In other words, the data was used to illustrate how the continental polar air mass differently affects the snowfalls in the Great Lake areas. Also, B is too broad. The lecture only covers the regions of the Great Lakes, so B is out. Sea is too broad. The lecture does not talk about all air mass, but only the continental polar air mass. And also, the lecture does not talk about all types of precipitation, which includes rain and hail. The lecture only talks about snowfalls. So C is out. D deals with only the first segment of the lecture. Since D is too narrow, it is out. So A is the only one we can't eliminate. So A has to be the answer. Question 2. This question asks for a true fact. So this question is an information question. For this type, you should take good notes. The questions are usually in the order of the lecture, so information relating to 2 can be found in the earlier part of the lecture. Take a listen.
Continental polar air masses form over a continent near the poles, over areas that are typically cold and dry. And it's the polar air masses from the Arctic and northern Canada that largely influence weather patterns in the United States, especially in the east of the Rocky Mountains. Now, these continental polar air masses are not generally associated with heavy precipitation. In fact, since they generally remain dry and cold throughout their trek across North America, they bring the mostly clear skies and cooler temperatures we see throughout most of the eastern United States during the winter months. However, when a polar air mass sweeps across the Great Lakes region in late autumn and winter, it can bring extremely heavy snowfalls to that region. We refer to these snowstorms as lake effect snows whose moisture comes from the Great Lakes themselves.
It is said that a continental polar air mass is dry and cold. So A and B should be the correct property. 3 is an inference question. So you have to infer a true fact based on the lecture. These are a few things that you need to remember when solving an inference question. The correct choice is not the one mentioned in the lecture. If the option sounds like something that you heard in the lecture, the option almost always is not the correct one. Second, you have to be able to prove why the option you chose is true based on what was said in the lecture. So what can we know about Lake Superior based on the information that it is the northernmost lake? These are some relevant facts you know from the lecture. First, the continental polar air mass moves from northwest to southeast. Second, northwest towns surrounding Great Lakes don't get as much snow as southeast towns surrounding the Great Lakes. A, there's nothing we can infer about clouds based on the fact that Lake Superior is the northernmost lake. So A is not an attractive option. B makes a comparison. When a comparison is made, make sure you understand what is being compared. A wrong comparison is often used as a trap in TOEFL reading and listening questions. From 1 and 2, we can infer that cities downward Lake Superior will receive more snow than cities on the northern part of Lake Superior. That is, if the comparison is made between cities around the Lake Superior, then we can infer some facts about their snowfalls. But B compares the snowfalls between the cities on downward Lake Superior with cities near other Great Lakes. For this reason, we can infer that B is true, and most likely, B should be false. This is how I reason. Since we know that Lake Superior is the northernmost lake, we know that other Great Lakes are located in further southern areas, and because of 2, we can infer that cities in southern and eastern parts of the lakes can have even more snow than the cities of the downward shores of Lake Superior. C. Since the lake is located in the most northern part compared with other lakes, we can infer that the land surrounding Lake Superior can be colder than the land of the other Great Lakes. You can also infer that water temperature should be constant among all the Great Lakes, as all these lakes are connected with each other. From this, we can infer that the temperature difference between Superior Lake and the land surrounding the Superior Lake is greater than the temperature difference between other lakes and the lands surrounding these other lakes. So C can be inferred. D doesn't make much sense. D asks for the order of events. For this type, you can think of the logical sequence without even relying on the lecture. The strategy for this type of question is similar to the ones that you can find in the sentence insertion question in my TOEFL reading course. A says that air becomes unstable. Unstable air implies that air will be moving or windstorm is brewing. B talks about the lakes absorbing energy. The lakes absorbing energy means water is heated. C says that the air acquires heat and moisture from the lakes. For C to be possible, the lakes have to be heated. So we can infer that B causes C. That is, B comes before C. Also from C, we know that when the air is heated, it will become unstable. So we can infer that C causes A. D says that when the windstorm hits the land, it will make snowfalls. Since A talks about unstable air or windstorming, A should cause D. So the answer should be B, C, A, D. Number 5. This is another inference question. Why Thunder Bay is not much affected by the lake effect snow means that why Thunder Bay does not have much snow. So we need to look for a reason that explains this fact. A. If Thunder Bay is close to the lake, then there should be more snow. So A is not true. B. The continental polar air mass moves from northwest to southeast. Southeast area is where the most snow falls. So we can infer that Thunder Bay must be located on northwest side. Since B explains why Thunder Bay does not have much snow, B is a good choice. C cannot be a correct choice because its truth is too obvious based on our common sense. As emphasized, an option that is true independent of the lecture content is almost always used as a trap in the TOEFL listening and reading. D is suspicious. Thunder Bay gotta be somewhere around the Great Lakes, and the lakes are called great because of their sizes. So talking about the size of the lake should be irrelevant. For this reason, we can eliminate D. So B has to be the answer. Let's look at the last question about prediction. This gotta be an easy question. A is too obvious based on our common sense, so it cannot be a good choice. Of course, it will vary, right? If an option is too obviously true, without even reading the lecture, it's not a good choice. B definitely makes this option wrong. Definitely indicates absoluteness. Just one counterexample will make that statement wrong. In my TOEFL reading course, you learn how to use qualifiers as clues to identify wrong choices. C, again, will makes it suspicious. Just like the definitely in B, will is an absolute term. An option that has an absolute term should be a good candidate to eliminate. you should learn how to use qualifiers as clues to identify wrong choices from my TOEFL reading course. D. Possible makes it a great choice. How the weather will change in the future due to the global warming? Nobody knows. So it has to be qualified with words like possibly or probably. So based on the way all these options are worded, D has to be the correct answer.
Listen to part of a lecture in an earth science class.
As you know from your reading, an air mass is it's a large body of air that's got uniform properties in terms of temperature and moisture. There are 4 types of air masses, and the one we'll concentrate on today is the continental polar air mass. Continental polar air masses form over a continent near the poles, over areas that are typically cold and dry. And it's the polar air masses from the Arctic and northern Canada that largely influence weather patterns in the United States, especially in the east of the Rocky Mountains. Now, these continental polar air masses are not generally associated with heavy precipitation. In fact, since they generally remain dry and cold throughout their trek across North America, they bring the mostly clear skies and cooler temperatures we see throughout most of the eastern United States during the winter months. However, when a polar air mass sweeps across the Great Lakes region in late autumn and winter, it can bring extremely heavy snowfalls to that region. We refer to these snowstorms as lake effect snows whose moisture comes from the Great Lakes themselves. Let me explain how this happens. But first, here's a map of the region. You see Rochester on the southern shore of Lake Ontario and Buffalo on the far eastern shore of Lake Erie? These 2 cities are among the snowiest cities in America, thanks largely to the lake effect. Over one recent 10-year period, Rochester and Buffalo each received 27 meters of snow. That's nearly 90 feet. Okay, let's turn to the other pair of cities on this map, Thunder Bay and Marquette. As you can see, they're both on the shore of Lake Superior, but Marquette consistently gets 2 to 3 times more snow than Thunder Bay. Why? Basically, what happens is that during the summer, bodies of water, especially ones as large as the Great Lakes, absorb huge amounts of energy, both from the sun and from the warm summer air that's passing over them. So the lakes become these giant reservoirs of heat, whereas the land around the lakes, land doesn't store heat as effectively as water does. As a result, during the cold seasons, fall and winter, the land loses its heat quickly. The land gets cold fast. And as you go farther north, it gets very, very cold. But the lakes store heat more efficiently, so they stay warmer longer. So eventually, you get these significant temperature disparities between the lakes and the land that surrounds each one. There can be about an 8-degree Celsius temperature difference at the southern Great Lakes and up to about a 17-degree disparity farther north, where the water is still warm, but the land is particularly cold. Then, here comes the dry continental polar air mass, cold air, moving southeastward across the fairly warm lakes. Polar air masses generally move from the north and west to the south and east. Okay, and warm air rises, right? So, the warm, moist air from the lake rises up into the cold, dry air above it. Then the difference in temperature inside the air mass creates instability, an unstable and turbulent situation in the atmosphere. As the warm air rises through the cold air, it cools down and condenses, forming clouds. In the clouds, snowflakes form, and snowfall occurs over the lake and on the downward shores. And because they're downwind, cities to the south and east of the Great Lakes will get more snow. So, because of their location, Marquette, Buffalo, and Rochester get buried each winter, while Thunder Bay on Lake Superior's northern shore doesn't get hit as hard. I should mention that many scientists predict that lake effect snowstorms will increase in frequency and intensity over the course of this century. They point out that the average temperature of the Great Lakes surface waters increased during the last century, while ice cover decreased. So, if this continues, which we certainly can't rule out, there'll be less lake water freezing and more that evaporates into the continental polar air masses for longer periods of time each winter. So winters around the Great Lakes will keep getting wetter, which means more snow. Or does it? Well, let me point out that if air temperatures keep increasing in the next 100 years, polar air mass temperatures will too, and winters will be much milder. And to get snow, even though these areas get a lot of precipitation, the air would still have to be cold enough to support snowfall, as opposed to rain.